Hey, welcome back to the City Rev Life Podcast. My name is Josh, and I am joined here with the one and only Pastor Robey, and we are continuing our series on self-sacrifice. How are you doing today, Robey?
I'm good. I'm just laughing at your introduction of me. Thank you.
Why?
I mean, there's probably another Pastor
no,
Robey.
I really
I'm
don't
sure
think there's another
else.
Robey out there.
No, actually, I've come across them from time to time.
No way.
That's true.
Another Robey?
Yes.
I have never heard of
Robies.
or met another Robey.
They're out there.
I've met a lot of Robbies.
There's a lot of Robies, but there's an occasional Robey, and they're a crazy bunch. You know.
Yeah.
The Lord knew we didn't need too many of them out in this world.
You're in a great crew of Robies.
Yes. There's more. There's more.
Well, why don't you catch us up? This is part 3. Where have we been? What have we talked about? Self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
And what are we going to be talking about today?
So the subject of this podcast is about self-sacrifice. That's the series we're in. For starters, self-sacrifice is such a key part of the gospel, key part of the faith. Why? I mean, the core of our faith is the Son of God laid down his life to save us. We're lost in our sins.
The ultimate picture of self-sacrifice.
Yeah, Jesus. I mean, it's the core. It's the centerpiece. Jesus laid down his life for us. That was a payment for sin, and we cannot be saved without the Son of God sacrificing himself. He rose again from the dead, and the self-sacrifice of Jesus is our salvation. So, I mean, it is the core of the redemption of our lives, and really the whole universe. And so as we're called to follow after Jesus, one of the things we're told is that the picture of following after Jesus, the picture of what it means to live a life of love, is to lay down our lives. So we are called to self-sacrifice. And that's very important. I mean, just as a point of review, if I'm only in relationships for what they do for me and how they serve me, how they benefit me, that's not really a life of love. If I'm in my marriage for how it meets my needs, or I'm in a friendship for how it meets my needs, that's not love. Love is self-sacrifice. It's laying my needs down and serving someone else. So that's great. And I think we have some concept of that. Of course, we need to be reminded of that. That's a difficult thing to work deeply into our lives because we have such a consumer mindset of what's in it for me.
Yeah, it goes against the grain of how we are.
Yeah.
Right? Our sinful nature, it's all about us. We want to make it all about us.
Yes.
Self-sacrifice seems counterintuitive.
Yes.
Seems like the opposite of what we want.
Exactly. And that idea is championed by our culture. I have my dreams, I have my goals, I have my wants. And if something doesn't fit with that, I get that out. It's kind of assumed that everyone's doing that. So you kind of find someone whose life goals are compatible with your life goals, and then you don't really need to self-sacrifice. You just can symbiotically, or parasitically walk with each other. We're talking about something richer of I actually lay my life down for others, first for the Lord, for Christ. I offer him my life. I live a life of worship. But then I want to live that life of love. I want to serve and sacrifice my spouse, my kids, my church, my friends, even my coworkers and neighbors. I want to find ways to lay my life down. The problem is that gets a little complicated. And so we want to uphold that. We're not pulling anything away from that, but we're just kind of getting a clean picture of that. And so in the first episode in this series, we talked about self-sacrifice, how that's a picture of love. In the second episode, the last episode in this series, we talked about self-sacrifice and self-care. So just because we're called to self-sacrifice doesn't mean that we don't have self-care. In fact, love your neighbor as yourself assumes some self-care. That's actually important and assumed in that. But there's more nuances in that. And what I want to bring this particular episode to is self-sacrifice. There's kind of a counterfeit that kind of masquerades as self-sacrifice. But if we kind of walk down the road with that counterfeit and not realize to kind of peel that part off and kind of pull that part off, it can be very dangerous. And that's the idea of a Messiah complex.
Okay, a Messiah complex.
Messiah
referring
complex.
to Jesus, our Messiah.
Yes.
What is a Messiah complex?
Yes. So the idea is sometimes we can believe that it's all up to us, that it's all on our shoulders, whether it's at work. If I'm not there, everything falls apart. Or it's at home, I've got to be the one to do it. Or maybe it's peacemaking in a friendship or friend group. I've got to be the one to do that. If I don't do it, no one can do it. Or with my kids, like if I'm not present, they need, or it's ministry, it's at church, you serve in your church or you lead a ministry. I'm needed. I have to be there. If I'm not there, it won't function. This idea that it's all up to me is this idea of a Messiah complex. And we usually, the problem with that one is it feels so noble.
Right. It sounds right.
It sounds...
Because it drives you to self-sacrifice.
Right.
Right.
And it sounds, it sounds noble, and it masquerades as self-sacrifice. But in the end, it's not that. It actually is a form of self-righteousness. It's actually a form of pride.
Interesting.
And in the end, it will lead us to burnout. It will lead us to not being our best. It will lead us to not being prioritized. It will lead us to not raising up other leaders. It will lead us to not trusting other people. And in the end, it's a lack of humility. And so it leads us to serving all the family, serving all the friends, serving all the ministry, serving all the work. And there are some people that would say, check, 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 check in all of those categories.
Right.
And let's just be careful that underneath that is not a Messiah complex. I don't mean that to be ugly, because I've seen this in my life. Good, godly people that are maybe don't have, like, they're not conceited, they're not arrogant, but pride comes in all kinds of different forms underneath the surface. So we want to watch for that.
Yeah, that is so good. And I'm wondering if that is a leading reason why people associate self-sacrifice with burnout. Because when you hear self-sacrifice, you often get that thought of, oh yeah, I'm always sacrificing. I'm always laying my own life down for people around me, and I am just exhausted by it. I am burnt out. And so self-sacrifice in a different way sounds distasteful, and it's a deterrent. And it's so funny you're talking about this, because I as well definitely struggle with this. This past year, I got
that's
chance.
why we actually brought this one up.
This is why you put me on the podcast.
This is not really a podcast. It's an intervention.
Okay,
that's why we invited you. Here,
we could do this off camera.
Oh, that was a good point.
I don't know that we need mics and a camera to have this conversation. This is really awkward now.
No, I'm kidding.
No.
We all do struggle with it to some degree.
Well, this past year, maybe I didn't realize that I did until this past year I got the opportunity to take a sabbatical.
Yes.
And I remember talking to you about it, leading up to it, like, oh my goodness, because it was going to be 6 weeks, right? Which is a huge blessing for my family, for myself to just get away and rest. But I remember talking with you about it and saying, I don't know how I'm going to take 6 weeks off. Like, who's going to do everything that I do? Like, I promised Robey, like, I do things around here, and I feel like I don't know how to take that much time off. And so in that process of delegating and finding leaders to own different parts of my job, right? I got back and I'm like, wait, do they actually need me? Like, it went too well without me.
Right.
These people that stepped up to the plate and took different roles in different areas of ministry, they did incredible. And I'm like, oh, okay. Did I just like work myself out of a job here?
Yeah. And I have had similar feelings when I've taken a sabbatical. This is one of the things about rest. Rest humbles us. And, the Lord, God has wired us to have to every night lay down, go unconscious, and be in an extremely vulnerable position. Every day, you have to like shut off, or you'll die. I mean, you'll die without sleep. And so, like, we need that. We absolutely have to have rest. And most of us, whether it's taking a day off, taking our vacation, taking an extended break, a sabbatical, and that's not just for people that are in academia or in ministry. There's more and more writing in business periodicals about taking sabbaticals and taking time away. Like, more and more, I've read several Forbes articles and Harvard Business Review articles about like that being advocated for because you've got to take time away. I think the main reason we don't rest is actually it comes back to a pride where we feel like, well, we're telling ourselves, well, if I rest, things will fall apart. Why would I tell myself that? Because it makes me feel needed.
Right.
It makes me feel significant. But that prideful significance is kind of masking, or is kind of masked. It's behind this facade of self-sacrifice.
Yeah,
and so
it's not that we're not needed. It's
Yes.
not that people don't need us, but it's also that they have other people that jump in. It's not all about us.
Yes, it's not about us, and there's a sense in which we're valuable,
Right.
but we're expendable in the end.
Right.
I mean,
the Lord's going to do what he's going to do.
The Lord's going to do what he's going to do, and the world will go on. But I've had similar feelings. I've come back from sabbatical and like, man, I hope it went well while I was gone. And then I'm kind of like, but what if it went too well? Like exactly like you said, it's nervous. But why don't you read this passage here, 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 8.
Sure. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building.
So here's Paul is talking about him and this other pastor, Apollos. They know each other. They've worked together. Both have been in Corinth at different times ministering, and there's this debate about... It's so funny because it's such an ancient debate, but we just see so many modern expressions of this. But some people are like, oh, I prefer Apollos. Well, no, I prefer Paul. Well, Apollos is better. No, Paul's better. And Paul's like, stop. I just want you to know, like, Apollos is nothing, and I am nothing. God is the one who's given the growth in you. And he says, we're just fellow workers with God, but you belong to God, and God's the one giving the growth. We are nothing.
Yeah.
In the end, Paul is saying, is cutting through all of that kind of need for self-value, self-worth, and he's just saying, he's modeling something for us. If I die, God doesn't really need me, and I'm not. If I die, next man up. It's like God can use anybody. He used that donkey in the Old Testament. Exactly. He really doesn't need us. And like that's what we need to humble ourselves to say is, I'm not really needed, but I'm valued. Like God doesn't need me. The world doesn't need me, but that doesn't mean I'm not valuable. I'm just finding my value somewhere else. My value is that God is in the gospel. I'm so cherished and treasured by God that he sent his son to die for me and pay for my sins, and he rose again. And so now I'm adopted as a son or daughter of God. That's where my value is. My value is not in what I produce. It's not what I hold up. It's not my leadership. It's not what I accomplish. It's not what I achieve. That's not where my value is. So let's bring all this back to this idea of self-sacrifice. Think about it like this. Self-sacrifice like the Messiah, not as the Messiah. I'm not the Messiah. I'm not the Savior. It's Jesus that is holding all things together.
That's so good.
It's by him and through him. He's the author and perfecter. He's the sustainer of all that is. I am not the sustainer of all that is. Jesus is. So I do self-sacrifice as modeled by Jesus, as modeled by the Messiah, but I am not the Messiah. I'm not needed. Like if I'm, heaven forbid, if I'm dead tomorrow, I think there'd be people that I love and that love me that would be very, very sad, but the world will go on. The mission of Christ will go on. Josh will be sad.
Despite this intervention, I'll still be sad.
I have one person that'll be sad. I mean, like in the end, like we're valued, but God, we're not needed.
Yeah.
And so we have to, when we self-sacrifice, we have to be careful that it's not a Messiah complex behind this veneer of self-sacrifice.
That's so good. For me, that's humbling, but that also brings a lot of peace.
Yes.
Knowing that God is going to do what God is going to do with or without me.
Yes.
And that he will use me.
Yes.
I hope he will. But he's going to do it. He's going to do the work. I'm going to water. I'm going to plant wherever God sends me. But he's going to be the one that's responsible for the growth.
Yes.
Which just seems so, you mentioned it earlier, countercultural.
Yes.
Right? The culture, they try to pump you up and encourage you to find your value in the thing you're doing. So then you will go harder and harder and harder at it because you are needed, you are necessary. But God is saying, no, find your value in me. let me work through you, and just have peace knowing I'm the one that brings the growth.
Yes. It's not all on our shoulders. And one of the things that really cuts into is rest. And so self-sacrifice does assume that we're taking rest. If we're not operating with a Messiah complex, we know that we need to rest. And by the way, the Messiah rested.
Yeah.
So I love this in Mark 1:35-39. And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon, those who were with him, searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went through all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Listen, the Messiah, Jesus withdrew. And everyone, and he is actually the one that's upholding everything. And everyone's like, "Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? Go find Jesus. Go find Jesus."
Could you imagine being one of the disciples, constantly losing your rabbi,
Yeah,
your teacher,
where did he
like
go?
your Messiah? He just disappears all the time, and you have to go find him.
Yeah, and so that was his habit. He would withdraw, he would rest, he would pray, he would recharge. And there were all these people that said they needed him, and he's like, even he withdrew and modeled that for us. God modeled it. He created the world for 6 days and rested on the seventh. And actually, God doesn't need to rest. We actually need to rest. And so if God, who doesn't need to rest, rested, and then what are we thinking about ourselves if we think we don't need rest? Like that's real pride there. Yeah. So self-sacrifice is different from the Messiah complex. We self-sacrifice like the Messiah, not as the Messiah. And if we're practicing that, then just like our Messiah, we will retreat and rest and know that it's not all up to us.
So good. Self-sacrifice like the Messiah, not as the Messiah. Any final words?
Just encouragement to you as you're thinking through all the places that you're serving is what is God calling you to do in terms of rest? How is God calling you to rethink your rhythms, and how can you make rest an act of faith and raise up people around you to step in, but it's not all on your shoulders. Take advantage of what God's called you to do and rest and recharge. So good. Well, thank you again, Pastor Robey. Hey, thanks for joining us. We will see you guys next week as we continue this series on self-sacrifice.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life Podcast. Feel free to subscribe and leave a rate and review. We love it when you share it with your friends on social media, so don't forget to tag us at cityrev.church. If you're interested in more resources, download our City Rev Church app and follow us on social media. Have a great day.